Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets are fighting for their play-in lives, and what do you know it? Ben Simmons will not be on the floor to help them do it. Simmons ruled out for the remainder of the season. How did the Nets get here? Where do they go from here? And what does it all mean? All that and more after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, thank you all for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Recording this at about 11 a.m. on Thursday, and we just got the news earlier this morning that Ben Simmons is being shut down for the remainder of the season by the Nets due to a lingering back injury. And in this episode, I want to break down all the encompassing aspects of this. How did the Nets get here? What does it mean for them moving forward? What does it say about the front office and the coaching staff, how this injury has gone over Simmons' tenure and the season with the Nets underwhelming? Because the Ben Simmons experience obviously has been a doozy. If you're listening to this podcast, you know that. So just breaking down the timeline of this Simmons injury and how this is kind of all unfolded. Obviously, the Nets acquire him at the 2022 trade deadline for James Harden. He sits out the rest of that season due to a back injury and mental health issues. That's always been kind of unclear which one of it was. His camp said it's both. But then he plays 42 games in 2022-23 last season before he's shut down at the All-Star break due to a nerve impingement in the right side of his back. Then he comes back. He has a seven-month rehab process this offseason. He says he's feeling the best that he's felt since he joined the Nets. He plays 6 games into this season, and then he's forced out due to a nerve impingement in the lower left side of his back, so a different impingement. Then he's out for 3 months. He returns. He plays for about 9 games, and then he exits a February 24th loss to the Minnesota Timberwolves due to what they call leg soreness, but it turns out that's just stemming from the nerve impingement. And he's out since then, and now he's shut down. And this is what the Nets had to say in a statement. They said, Ben Simmons will remain out for the remainder of the season while he consults with specialists and explores treatment options for the nerve impingement in his lower back. Simmons, along with his representatives and Nets medical personnel, are currently in discussions with numerous experts to determine the course of action that will provide him with the best opportunity for long-term sustainable health. So there's a lot to break down surrounding this, because while Ben Simmons at this point, I think it's pretty clear that he's no longer a significant, piece to the Nets in terms of what they're trying to do on the floor. And that's obviously been much debated this season. I always thought kind of, it's a little bit silly based on his injury history and based on once we got into the start of this season and Simmons had that injury update 7 games into their season and they said it was a nerve impingement. They initially said it was hip soreness. Now it's a nerve impingement. As soon as I heard that, I wrote an article right after that said that pretty much the whole basis of the article was the Nets can't depend on Simmons. This experiment is cooked. He should not be a focal point of the team's game planning if and when he does come back. And that's kind of the way that it played out. And even, at the trade deadline, the Nets obviously needed a point guard because Spencer Dinwiddie was checked out and was going to be out the door. And there were some people saying, Simmons isn't going to come back, this and that. And I tweeted and I said, the Nets depending on Simmons to come back and solve their issues at point guard, given his injury history and how many games he's missed, that would be insane, is what I said. It would literally be insane for them to do that. And Simmons' agent, Bernie Lee, actually quote tweeted me and said he's going to fix their issues. And, I think me and a lot of other people, when we saw that, were like, all right, whatever, Bernie, we'll believe it when we see it. I'm not going to get any more into that. And then he comes back. He looks okay for a few games, but then the injuries start to come back, and then he's shut down. And weirdly enough, his agent, Bernie Lee, took blame for these injuries. I think it was on Monday via SNY's Ian Begley wrote an article with some quotes from Lee and said that, I failed Ben. When I came back, I said that we were going to get this back injury in order. He said they're seeking non-surgical options in order to, allow him to resume his career on a permanent basis. But for me, breaking down, the Nets coaching staff, let's start there. With this season, how this all played out, it was, and it even more so is now, ultra concerning with how they approach this. Because coming into the year, even with Simmons sitting out the entire 2021-22 season or 2020-21 season, and then, having his injury struggles being forced after the second half of last year, Simmons was a focal point of the Nets' game planning this year. Jacque Vaughn said it from the jump. He gave, Simmons the starting point guard role, while somewhat reluctantly, I must add, but still he gave it to him. And Simmons pushing the pace, facilitating in the fast break, that was how the Nets were constructing their offense. And it was clear from the jump with how they deployed him. And, it was clear with some comments that we got from Jacque Vaughn, of Vaughn saying, we don't want to play in the half court. He went as far as admitting that. We want to be out in transition on the fast break. So Simmons, is the Nets' primary ball handler, at least in transition, which is where they want to be most of the time. And that's how they want to build their offense. Then he plays 7 games and then he's out. And then he comes back and they're trying to reintegrate him. And then you get the comments from Mikal Bridges about, we need a game plan for when Ben's in and when Ben is out, him seemingly agitated with the situation. And the Nets, come in with that game plan, and they really didn't have a ton of point guard depth outside of Simmons. They obviously have Spencer Dinwiddie, but with them trying to put Simmons into a focal role as the lead ball handler in the starting lineup, Dinwiddie, the first game of the year, was coming off the bench. That was the plan for Dinwiddie, and they were going to play him in a much heavier off-ball role. That was what they wanted to do. So they were really prioritizing Simmons, and that rubbed Dinwiddie the wrong way, along with other things as the season progressed. But it's just an indication of the level to which they were depending on him. And they did not build up point guard depth behind him. They signed Dennis Smith Jr., but obviously, Dennis Smith Jr. is more of a gadget player, a specialist player, a guy who can't shoot, adding to the concerns of Simmons being alongside Nick Claxton and also Day'Ron Sharpe as non-shooters in the Nets rotation. So the Nets focusing on, Simmons and game planning around him to the extent that they did this season and kind of putting some of their eggs in the Ben Simmons basket is frankly insane. And I said it and I'll continue to say it. And it's a major red flag for, that's a front office decision. That's partly a coaching staff decision. But in the Nets organization and how they're running as a whole, the fact that they were depending on Ben Simmons to this extent is alarming, because this isn't a team that was like, this is a transitional year. I will say it's a transitional year, but it's not like this is a Nets team that wasn't seeking, to be competitive and put together a good, streak and have some progress this year, given the fact that they want to acquire stars into the future. While it's a transition year, this was an important year. And I think that urgency was evident in the fact that Sean Marks fired Jacque Vaughn at the trade deadline at the All-Star break, and promoted interim head coach Kevin Ollie, and said when he made that move that we need to see some movement. We're not where we need to be. We're not where we expected to be. So that's just underscoring the fact that this wasn't like a throwaway season where the Nets were like, okay, Simmons is this, we'll try it out with him. We'll see what happens. Like, the Nets were trying to compete this year. The Nets were trying to show progress this year to pitch guys in the future, obviously, on coming to this team. And in that process, they somehow arrived at the conclusion of, we're going to put some eggs into the Ben Simmons basket. We're going to rely on him to do some things offensively, to provide some more defensive versatility, and curtail some of the rotations and some of the other personnel decisions around him. And completely unsurprisingly, that blew up in their faces. So, it's a bad look. It's a really bad look in terms of this season, from the front office to the coaching staff, how they went about that, all of that. It's not good. So that's just breaking it down from how it, affected them this season. And then, moving further back into how they got here and kind of the origin story of the Ben Simmons fiasco. As I said, it obviously started with the James Harden trade. And, this has been relitigated when talking about Sean Marks and his future and should he be on the hot seat and all that, the trade with the Philadelphia 76ers. But my issue with it is that people always want to focus on the trade and relitigate whether Sean Marks should have just held on to Harden, whether he should have just said, we're not going to take Simmons, we're not going to bite that bullet or whatever. We're going to hold on to Harden. That's what people like to say that he should have done. But, he was never going to do that. They were never going to risk, James Harden holding on to him past the trade deadline after they just traded all their future picks and Karis LeVert and Jared Allen and other stuff. They weren't going to risk James Harden walking and leaving him for nothing. So they do the trade with the 76ers, which obviously turned out to be a disaster. But that's not the issue to me. The issue is that Sean Marks got to a point where he was blindsided by James Harden, the player he just traded all the team's draft picks, amongst other stuff, for, He got blindsided 3 days before the trade deadline by him. He got to that point, and then he's bent over a barrel to the point where the Sixers were his only trade partner, and he has to make this move. So the issue isn't the Sean Marks trade, and the trade was an issue, but like relitigating how much of he should have done that. Should he have held on to James Harden? Like, that's not the crux of the issue. The crux of the issue is Sean Marks getting to a point where he's not on the same page as his stars whatsoever, and he's getting to a point where James Harden is coming into training camp in that 2021-22 season out of shape. Reportedly, Ramon Shelburne and other people at ESPN have reported that he was plotting his exit strategy in training camp of that season, and then turning around to Sean Marks in the Nets front office and saying, no, we're all good. Don't believe it. Unless you hear it from me, pretty much bullshitting them to their faces. And then they're blindsided and they have to make this move. So that decision and that whole development getting to that point, obviously there were external factors, whether it's, the COVID-19 season, the mandates, that forced Kyrie Irving out, the injuries in that Bucks series, external factors that were out of Sean Marks' control. But when you're a GM and you bring in personalities a la Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden of that magnitude, and you mortgage the future to do it, it's your job to manage those personalities. And Sean Marks getting to a point where he was blindsided like that is a major stain on his resume, because it's not like he was blindsided and got a ton back that was productive. He got back Ben Simmons, who's been a disaster, 2 first-round picks, one of which I think turned into Noah Clowney in last year's draft, and then a 2027 first that's protected 1 through 8. And then he also got back Seth Curry and Andre Drummond, who both walked and turned into nothing. So he made that trade, the initial trade with James Harden going, to the Nets from the Rockets, which I still have said, and I'll continue to say, I would have done 10 times out of 10 because it made the Nets, instant title contenders. And in that playoffs, they were title favorites before some unlucky injuries and then also the COVID-19, stuff. But him going from that initial point and then mismanaging it, or the team just mismanaging it as a whole, during the process of after Harden came to Brooklyn, to the point where they're saddled with Ben Simmons and they're stuck with this contract, and all of this turns out to be a disaster, and they part with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in that time phase, and now they're left in an uncertain position that hasn't gained a ton of clarity yet. All of that is a significant stain on Sean Marks' resume. And, the major stain, the handling of the big three in that James Harden situation and pivoting to this Simmons trade is the major stain, because up until that, Sean Marks has done a great job as Nets GM in terms of taking them out of the depths of what some had called the worst situation in NBA history, making savvy moves, identifying talent late in the draft, picking up some G League guys, creating a situation that seemed attractive enough to acquire guys like Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. He had done a great job up to that point. But since then, you can argue how much of it is external factors during, that 2020 to 22 period. But regardless, it's his job to manage the franchise. And this has turned into an abject disaster with this Ben Simmons trade. And, it brings up the question now of where do the Nets go from here? How do they handle the Simmons situation moving forward? Because, from a basketball standpoint, we're now at the point where Simmons is nothing more than just a number to the Nets. He's not going to be a factor in their game planning moving forward for next season. He's an expiring contract next season at $40 million. And how are they going to handle that? And a lot of people are discussing different situations of, could they waive him? Could they buy him out? Could they trade him? Could they trade him in the offseason? And what I'll say about that is the Nets' idea and the messaging that they've given over the last year has been them setting themselves up for 2025 to have a ton of cap space in that year, and also to have a ton of draft assets to acquire stars via trade or via free agency, or both. That's the plan right now. So the idea of waiving Simmons, that's not going to happen. The idea of stretching him, buying him out, that's not going to happen. They definitely don't want to add money to their books long term by, in a waive and stretch scenario. That's not going to happen. And then also Ben Simmons really doesn't have any incentive to agree to a buyout and leave money on the table, because this is all, looking all the more likely that it's going to be his last significant contract. So he's not going to agree to that. So basically what Simmons turns into next season and how the Nets are going to handle this is he turns into a $40 million expiring contract that's going to get paid out. The first half of that, the first $20 million of that's going to get paid out in the first half of the year. And then they're going to get to the trade deadline, and he's going to have $20 million remaining on that contract. And they're going to be put to a decision of, Do we want to just let this expire, or do we want to trade this potentially as an expiring, go to a team that's looking to, get off long-term money and bring back role players, for Simmons' expiring contract and kind of get value that way? And I don't see that happening. I think that the overwhelmingly likely scenario is that the Nets bite the bullet on the second half of that season. They've already swallowed most of the bullet. They can bite a little bit more and just let Simmons expire and create a ton of cap space in 2025, at which point, it's going to be a really good free agent class. Now, before I get into that and the free agency and all that, I'm just going to explain why I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason being that if a team were looking to get off long-term money with, several role players and, shed that off their books and, create their own cap space or do whatever they want, whether just to save money, they're often not doing that because they like those players. Like if they like those players, they wouldn't be trying to get off of them. They'd be holding on to them. So they're players that they're comfortable parting with. And while those players are almost certain to have more value than Simmons does, they may not be contracts that the Nets want to have on their books long term. Now, the caveat to that is, it really all comes back to the free agent class and the cap space in 2025, because the question then becomes, are the Nets going to want to take on these multiple mid-sized salaries, players who are obviously going to be more valuable than Simmons from an on-court perspective, but add money to their long-term books and, hurt their 2025 cap space or eliminate a large chunk of that? The answer is going to depend on how they evaluate what is happening in that 2025 free agent class, which is a very good class. It's one of the better classes that you're going to see in a really, really long time. And the Nets are positioned to have upwards of $40 million in cap space, in that offseason, because right now in 2025, 2026, it'll be the only players that the Nets have in their contract right now are Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson. They have Dorian Finney-Smith on a player option. They are going to have to decide on what happens with Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe, obviously, who will be on extensions at that point, if not with the Nets, with somebody else. And then they're also going to have Nick Claxton, who, is a free agent this offseason, and probably they're looking to extend him. So that'll factor into it. But regardless of all those moves, the Nets are going to have a really big chunk of cap space, probably upwards of $40 million, potentially more, depending on how they maneuver it. And this is a free agent class that's going to be headlined by Jason Tatum, amongst numerous other guys. I'm not going to get into the full list right now, and it's very attractive. Now, the issue with that oftentimes is that it's trending. The NBA is trending in a direction where free agents don't hit the open market. That's not how free agents and stars change teams most of the time now. We've seen it that NBA stars just like to get their money and then figure out the rest later. So they'll sign their extensions as soon as possible to avoid injury risks and all that stuff. And then if they want to change teams later, they'll just request a trade. As we saw with Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant signed a max extension with the Nets. He requested a trade before he even played one game of it. So that's like the most glaring example of it. But the fact being, and the point taken away, is that a lot of the time stars don't hit free agency. Does that mean that a star will never hit free agency again and it's just dead as a way of teams, acquiring star players? No, but a lot of the time that's just not how it's done anymore. So the Nets are in a position where they're going to have all that cap space potentially, and all these guys might be, are in line to be free agents. But they're going to have to evaluate, will those guys actually become free agents? And are we saving that cap space for that summer? How likely, with intel they get around from the league, how likely is it that we're going to have a shot at one of those guys? So that will factor into it. And if the answer is yes, and they think that they're going to be major players and pieces available in that, free agent class that they can go after, there's no question they're going to let Ben Simmons expire and they're going to open up all this cap space. But if they don't, identify that, and it's looking more and more like all the big names are going to extend, there's not going to be a ton of guys available in that class, it opens up a conversation of where they could make that trade for Simmons, as his expiring contract for multiple role players in order to bring back some mid-side salaries that maybe they might like somewhat in the medium to long term as players, but more importantly are going to be mid-sized salaries that they can use as trade piece, salary fillers and trade chips moving forward to pair with their stockpile of draft picks to go after a star via trade. So that's, another way that they can go about it. And that's a scenario where it's plausible that they could look to trade Simmons as expiring, is if they don't see themselves having a major shot or there being major players available in that 2025 free agent class and they'd rather just parlay Simmons into players that might have some value and that also are just mid-sized contracts that they can use down the line to use in a trade for a star. Now, they could also look to just sign free agents who can be those mid-sized contracts to use in a trade for a star. So those are kind of the two routes that they can go with it. I said, I think it's much more likely that they're just going to let Simmons expire. They'll have that cap space for flexibility for, using that cap space either to sign free agents, or they could look to just absorb contracts via trades into that cap space, the trade exceptions that they have or with other players they're looking to part with. So, I think that they're going to hold on to Simmons, and that's the way that I would see this playing out. Multiple, overwhelmingly likely. So, that's kind of how I see it playing out, is out of the question that they can, make a trade and look to bring back some salary fillers and stuff like that. A situation could present itself, maybe, but I don't see that as all the, the most likely outcome here. I think it's much more likely that they're going to look to maximize cap space in that 2025 season and just be done with Ben Simmons and let him expire, at which point, who knows what happens with him. And, I want to close out the episode talking about, just, is this the end of Ben Simmons' career? Because while it might not have an impact on the Nets, it's one of the stranger storylines that we've seen in NBA history, frankly, of a guy who was drafted #1 overall, who was Rookie of the Year, with 3 All-Star teams, first team All-Defense, amongst other things, with the 76ers. Then his confidence just starts to go into the tank. It goes downhill. That coincides, obviously, with some injuries, as that progresses. And then he's getting to a point where he's just a complete non-factor. This is a guy who was a 3-time All-Star not too long ago and was one of the best defenders in the league, one of the best passers in the league, was making a huge impact on the 76ers winning early on in his career, and has fallen off so precipitously and so fast that it's kind of baffling that it's gotten to this point. And, it gets to the point of, is Simmons' career over? And is he ever going to contribute for an NBA team again? And is he going to be able to work all the way back from this? Because, I laid out a little bit of the process of what happened with Simmons, but, after the Nets acquired him, he sat out the second half of that 2021-22 season. And then he had surgery on 2 discs, his L4 and his L5, in the 2022 offseason. It was a procedure called a microdissectomy, where they pretty much clean up stuff from bulging discs and they try to relieve pain there. Then he obviously played 42 games last year, and then he was shut down due to the nerve impingement in the right side of his back. And then what's really concerning to me, and what I think is a pretty awful sign in regards to will Simmons ever return to being a productive player again, is that he went through a 7-month rehab process, as I said. And he said this offseason that his body was feeling the best that it had since he joined Brooklyn, before proceeding to play 27 less games this year than he did last season. So he had all these injury issues last season. He was shut down in an attempt to manage this, and an attempt to have a really extended 7-month rehab process where he was going through all of this work to strengthen his knees, his back muscles, his core, all this stuff around that injury in order to be available for a long, sustainable period. And then it ends up being worse than it was the season before. That is extremely concerning from a health standpoint. Then there's often the mental component of this, which I'm not going to get too deep into. I'm not going to, debate whether he's faking, because that's just, I see people discussing that. And frankly, I just think it's kind of an irresponsible way to discuss something, an irresponsible line of, questioning on somebody's character when you don't have the inside information. So I'm not going to get too much into that. But I will say that, anytime that you sit out a full season, like Simmons did in 2020, 2021, which was strategic to force his way out of Philadelphia, but then he continued to sit out once the Nets acquired him. So anytime you sit out a full season, and that comes right after you were having significant, confidence issues, mental struggles on the court, with obviously what he did in that Hawks series and passing up that shot in Game 7, and just his fall off and the decline of his aggressiveness as an offensive player, there being a clear mental component to this. I mean, I've said it, I've done research on the numbers, and Simmons's usage rate, his shots per 36 minutes, have literally gone down every year of his NBA career. It's just a declining slope. So there's obviously confidence issues and mental issues. And then, directly after that, all of this stuff with the back pops up, where it's just continuously popping up. It's continuously forcing him out. He's not able to play. when he is playing, he's not that effective. And there's clearly still mental issues because when Simmons has played for the Nets, he's been, I don't know, terrified is too strong a word, but he's been extremely reluctant to go to the basket at all. And he's frankly terrified, I think is, appropriate to describe his thought about taking free throws. He does not want to go to the basket. He doesn't want to take free throws. You can get into the argument of how much of that is related to his back and how much of it is related to his brain and the correlation between those two, but it's there. So the idea of Ben recovering from both the physical, which back injuries are terrible. I'm not comparing myself to an NBA player, but I had significant back problems throughout my Division I college football career. And I've known a lot of other people who've had similar nerve issues where it shoots down their leg and you go through that pain on a day-to-day basis. It's brutal. Him trying to get back from that and also trying to get back from the mental things that predated the back injury and those issues and those blocks that he was having on the court, it does not seem likely at this point, honestly. And then, even if he is to try to do that, is Ben going to be willing after his contract expires next year to take a veteran minimums contract? If he isn't able to have a big resurgence this coming season, is he too prideful to do that? Will he want to, take a contract after being, this year he was on a $177 million contract over the last 5 years, a 3-time All-Star, former #1 pick, all those accolades I said. Is he going to take a minimum contract and try to be, probably along the lines of like a backup center, change of pace point guard option? It's tough to see. So it's unfortunate how this has all played out for the Nets, for the front office, and general manager Sean Marks, for the coaching staff, for Jacques Vaughn, who ultimately got fired because of some of these decisions. And then for Simmons, who hasn't been able to get on the floor, hasn't been able to stay on the floor, has just seen his career completely go by the wayside. It's unfortunate, but it says a lot about all three parties, from the Nets, coaching staff, front office, and Simmons. It says a lot about the issues with all of them. And, breaking it down just for the Nets and how I did, it's a really concerning development for the front office, how they got here, how they've handled it since then, and how they're going to go about it going forward. Because, Sean Marks, it's too early to say if he's on the hot seat, but this trade has been a disaster. It's been a really bad look. It's been something that, given the fact that it also led to the Nets trading Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant and completely blowing up their team and resetting the timeline, it's been something that not a lot of GMs would survive. And, how the Nets play out the rest of the season is going to have a big impact, I think, on how they're able to pitch stars, how they want to go about the future. Right now, they're 25-37. They're 3 games out of the last spot in the Eastern Conference play-in tournament, 10th place. And, they're not playing great basketball right now. They've won 4 of 6 in 3 of their last 4, but, they win back-to-back Hawks matchups, who are the team directly ahead of them in the Eastern Conference standings since the last time I potted. And they come back and they play a Memphis Grizzlies team with 9 wins and their best player being Luke Kennard, and they lose. And then, they come back the next night and they beat the Philadelphia 76ers, who were without Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, and it's a come-from-behind win and it's good and all that. But that Grizzlies loss, them having to claw out that Sixers win without them having their top 2 players, it just doesn't signal a team that is, ready to compete at anywhere near a playoff level. And if the Nets, I said it on my last podcast, if they continue to let go of the rope and this season really goes down the tank, it's concerning in terms of Sean Marks' future and whether it actually is going to be any sort of viable plan to try to get stars to join this situation and sign on to being here for their prime, whether it's a guy like Donovan Mitchell or whoever becomes available. If the Nets go down the tubes this season, that's really concerning. And that may be the final straw in, Sean Marks' series of issues during his time as GM, the biggest of which has been this Simmons trade and the handling of the Harden Big Three and all the stuff leading up to it. So a long-winded way of saying Ben Simmons is out. It's been a disaster, his tenure here. It's been a huge stain on Sean Marks' resume, and we'll see if he's able to resurrect it and he's able to save it with the Nets playing better in the second half of this season and then trying to parlay that into some stars in the future. So, we'll see where the Nets go from here. Appreciate you guys for listening. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode. As I said earlier, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Smash the like button. Leave a 5-star review if you can. I really appreciate that. It goes a long way. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. You can find all my work articles on ClutchPoints.com. Also, all my content, constant updates, news, analysis on Twitter at Erik Slater _. Going to have an exciting couple of guests on the pod in the next few days to, have a really fun segment that I don't want to reveal now, but will be made clear, as we get closer to that. So, the Nets are in Detroit tonight to kick off a 6-game road trip. They're going to have a back-to-back this weekend against the Charlotte Hornets and Cleveland Cavaliers. Word is that Cam Thomas, after missing the last 5 games, may be returning, this weekend. So we'll see how all that goes on. I'll have more updates for you guys along the way, more coverage here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you soon.